So our first speaker this morning is Deborah Bird-Rose, who is professor in the Environmental Humanities program at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. She's the author of many critically acclaimed books, including Dingo Makes Us Human, Life and Land in an Australian Aboriginal Context, which came out with Cambridge in 2000, Reports from a Wild Country, Ethics of Decolonization, 2004, and Wild Dog Dreaming, Love and Extinction from 2011. She's also the co-founder and co-editor of the International Journal Environmental Humanities and a leading thinker in this field well before it was actually declared a field. I first met Debbie a number of years ago in Newcastle, Australia, and the first thing that struck me was how giving she is as a person. She's just an absolutely wonderful person who you'll get to know over the next 3 days. She's an anthropologist by training, I would probably say a philosopher by spirit. She's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. So please welcome Debbie Bird-Rose.
Thanks, Brett. Merci. That's the extent of my French for this morning. Well, let me start by thanking Brett and Tanis and the sponsors. I'm just so happy to be here. I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations of this region and just bear in mind that, particularly in settler societies, we're always on ground that's bloodied by human conflict as well as conflicts with nature and animals. And I think we settler society peoples have a particular burden in considering how we engage with the multiple dimensions of violence around us. I also just briefly want to acknowledge the Extinction Studies Working Group, some of whom are here today, Brett, Jeff, Matt, and Mick. We've had lots of long conversations together, and my thinking on and with extinction is vastly enhanced through this great gang. And also the research was funded by the Australian Research Council Discovery Grant that I hold with Tom Van Duren, also a member of the group who would have been here today but is giving a prestigious lecture in Australia and hasn't yet mastered the art of being in two places at two times. I want to start briefly with just a couple of quotes for contemplation as I speak. We are obliged to think human and animal deaths as capable of illuminating each other in their separate darknesses. This is David Clark. And the cruelest thing about cruelty is that it dehumanizes its victims before it destroys them. That's Janina Bowman. I'm going to skip over my little facts and figures about extinction. I'm going to take it as given that we all know that there is a mass extinction event happening and that it's primarily anthropogenic, directly or indirectly in origins. And I want to move straight then into my case study, which concerns flying foxes, Tarapa species in Australia. There are 4 of them in Australia, 4 main Tarapa species. They're protected under native species legislation, and they can't be killed or captured without a permit. They're a keystone species because of their pollinating and seed dispersal work. 2 of the 4 are threatened with extinction and are further protected under the Commonwealth Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act of 1999. So of these 2, the gray-headed flying fox, which is the one you see here, is in serious decline, as is the spectacled flying fox population, which is the one I'm going to be talking about later, which appears, the speckies, spectacled flying foxes are called speckies in local parlance, they appear to have experienced a 78% loss over a 15-year period from 1985 to 2000. And there's at this moment, there's a big census project going on, so it may be that in a year or so we'll have better figures to work with. Well, the causes of population loss are well understood. For the most part, they're the same kinds of causes that we encounter with extinctions almost everywhere. Loss of habitat, in particular, which includes both loss of places to camp and losses of food, which has thrown flying foxes into ever greater proximity with humans, and then, of course, ever greater conflict. And whilst it seems unlikely that flying foxes would become technically extinct in that sense of there being no last surviving individuals, there probably will in care facilities and whatever for quite some time, they are already becoming functionally extinct. And it seems that their way of life co-evolved over millennia with the native forests of large areas of Australia will come to an end. Well, many humans are making huge efforts to help flying foxes, and many of the hazards of life can be managed to reduce impact. And as I will discuss later, this counter-extinction work is astoundingly generous and beautiful. But at the same time, and perhaps the great factor that often drops out of the conservation discourse, is human hatred and human cruelty. At this time, flying foxes are shot, tormented, distressed, and subject to hate language, along with calls for further eradication. They inhabit zones of increasing conflict and terror, and there's every reason to think that things are going to get worse. So in the first part of this paper, I'm going to discuss this zone of persecution, hatred, and cruelty, and I do this as something of a reluctant witness. I experience conflict around the project of giving persecution any more publicity than it already has, and it is quite distressing to talk about and read about. And yet persecution has actually taken on a semblance of normalcy, at least in a lot of the political discourse. It appeals to things like rational management and so on, and construes flying foxes as a disruptive problem. So I want to defamiliarize the normalcy. I want to probe its workings. I want to disrupt its complacency. And then in the second part of the paper, I'll present a case study of flying fox rescue. And this work is so strategic and so dedicated that it too has the appearance of normalcy, and I want to defamiliarize that as well. So central to both parts is the convergence of individual suffering on the one hand and the precarity of life for two species that are nearing extinction. Okay, September 7th, 2012. It was Threatened Species Day in Australia, and it was the day the Queensland government announced it was revoking its ban on shooting flying foxes. Behind that action lay a further announcement that it had exempted flying foxes from the anti-cruelty legislation in order to resume shooting. Even the two species threatened with extinction can now legally be shot in Queensland. The legislation made them both killable and something we don't quite have a word for, cruelable. That is, it made them legally vulnerable to human cruelty. The September 7th announcement in the Brisbane Courier Mail under the headline, "Queensland farmers allowed to shoot flying foxes from today," read in part, "State Environment Minister Andrew Powell will allow farmers to shoot flying foxes despite the government's Animal Welfare Advisory Committee finding it inhumane. In an effort to make the process as humane as possible, only farmers can apply for permits. They must use 12-gauge shotguns with heavy shot and only on stationary animals rather than those in flight." You can imagine how effective that's going to be. An annual quota of 10,580 will be set for the four species. Mr. Powell, this is the minister, Environment Minister, Mr. Powell said he was confident the culling could be done humanely. And apparently it's no accident, of course, that the announcement was made on Threatened Species Day. It was a very, politically provocative moment. Well, Australian flying foxes, as I've said, are keystone species. They travel hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers per year, pollinating blossoms. I lost track of my things here. This was actually a flying fox that was shot in Sydney, in Chetwood. And he lay on the ground for, we don't know how long, still alive, until he was rescued and operated on. They got the bullet out of his thing, and he's recovered from that. He'll never go bush again. But the whole idea that killing things can be done in a way that is humane becomes quite bizarre. Okay, so flying foxes are keystone species. They travel hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers per year, pollinating blossoms and dispersing seeds. They feed at night and camp together in trees during the day. I should say, in case any of you don't know, these megabats do not navigate by echolocation. They navigate by sight and memory. They, along with their nomadism, they have an intensely strong sight fidelity. They return year after year to many of the same camps for birthing and later for mating. The human perception of conflict with flying foxes arises in three main areas, each of which can be understood as a management issue, and each of which, for each of which there are strategies for management, and each of which has also been taken up as fuel for vilification, persecution, and hatred. So the first is orchards, where flying foxes eat or damage fruit. Here the main alternative is to install netting, and many farmers who have done so report very good results. It doesn't really solve the problem of starvation for flying foxes, but it at least resolves the conflict between orchardists and flying foxes. A second area of conflict concerns human habitation, including cities, suburbs, and towns, where flying foxes have come to camp either permanently or periodically. And many residents are bothered by them, and one response is to disperse them by harassing and tormenting them, even to the point of cutting down the trees in which they camp. And the main alternative here, of course, is to learn the arts of coexistence, as many people in many areas have done and continue to do. The third area of conflict concerns the fact that flying foxes are host to two zoonotic viruses. Hendra virus, which is transmissible to horses, and a number of horses have died. From horses, it's transmissible to humans, and several humans have died. There is now a vaccine, so this problem should be no more. The other is Lyssa virus, which is closely related to rabies. It is preventable with vaccination, and even without vaccination, it can be prevented if the bite or scratch is treated immediately and consistently. As far as is known, only 3 people have ever died of Lyssa virus. One of them was a child, however, in Queensland, who died earlier this year. I want to turn now to the idea of persecution, or the facts. The philosopher David Clark considers one lesson to be drawn about ethics and killing is that we learn more about the mass killing of both humans and other animals when we examine them together. That humans are treated as animals in order to make them killable is well known through the study of genocide. My purpose in analyzing both is to examine cultural patterns underlying cruelty and killing in both spheres. So I'm going to turn briefly to the West's long and dishearteningly consistent history of persecution, a story that is monolithic in its longevity and in its power to organize suffering and killing. The historian R.I. Moore argues that persecution has been a key organizing principle in Europe since around the 12th century. His analysis is very rich in detail, which I won't be going into, but in brief, he makes the case that around the year 1100, Western Europe, he says, became a persecuting society and has remained one. And the geographical focus, of course, now includes regions that have been colonized by Western Europe. Moore discusses, quote, the deliberate and socially sanctioned violence directed through established governmental, judicial, and social institutions against groups of people defined by general characteristics such as race, religion, or way of life. Once in process, it follows that mere membership within such a group was sufficient justification for violence. Targets have changed with time, and it is central to Moore's analysis that the established patterns, procedures, and rhetoric of persecution, which were established in the 12th century, have given it the power of infinite and indefinite self-generation and self-renewal. Well, hatred is integral to persecution, and in an important new study, The Ideology of Hatred, Nizayane writes that while it is almost pointless to ask what hatred is, she finds another question well worth analysis: what does hatred want? So I'm going to ask about the particular hatred evinced most compellingly on September 7th. What does that hatred want, and how does it normalize itself? On the political side of the story, the decision was at least as much about party politics as it was about animals. And it's very clear that hatred wants votes, and votes are a means to an end, that hatred wants power. Or then again, we might turn that around in some areas and say power wants or needs hatred. But then again, there is the scapegoating of animals. Flying foxes are among several species, including dingoes, that are bearing the brunt of anger and fear amongst primary producers. In the face of climate change, wobbly global financial markets, international regulations, land degradation, and long histories of ill-informed practices, animals are blamed and killed, from which we may posit hatred wants security, and failing that, it wants someone to blame. The September 7th decision showed a set of sovereignty issues as well, working across several scales: state versus commonwealth, rural versus urban, and the right of private property versus any legislation emanating from anywhere. Questions of sovereignty are integral to all this death, and as Foucault has taught us, the right to kill is deeply bound up with the right to sovereignty. So hatred wants some sort of sovereignty. Politics, votes and power, sovereignty and security converge in a wildly energetic discourse of danger and retaliation, often in Australia expressed most publicly by a fellow named Bob Catter, a member of Parliament, a Queensland member of Parliament, one might add. His recent fulminations on television news about the need for more killing were described as a declaration of war. Standing in the garden of a private property that was quarantined because of Hendra virus, he shouted, "They have to die." Moving on to the issue of people's rights to shoot flying foxes, particularly in their own backyards, he said, "They're the greatest possible danger to human life, to your wives and children, and the government says you can't remove that danger, but like damned hell." This comment was elaborated in another report in which he criticized both the federal government and the state government, saying now these two warped groups of people, that's the state government and the federal government, these two warped groups of people honestly believe that these flying foxes have the right to your backyard, but you don't have the right to your backyard. From which I think we have to posit, amongst other things, that hatred wants to be the victim. The discourse justifies violence through an inversion of victimhood that claims it is all the fault of the persecuted. In Bob Catter's memorable rave, the bats have more rights to your backyard than you do. Hatred wants righteousness. The rhetoric and apparatus of persecution works with an organizing concept of the enemy within. As R.I. Moore explains, one of the first steps in developing a target for persecution was to develop a story to account for the classification enemy. The target group did things. It killed children, or it poisoned the water, or it spread disease. Any of you who've read about the Black Death would know how this played out in that kind of context of fear. Moore's analysis enables us to discern a cultural pattern based on the root metaphor of the human body. The microcosm is the human body, the macrocosm is society or the social body, and a key process is the replication and oscillation between microcosm and macrocosm. It becomes very much a kind of self-validating set of concepts by operating at two scales that seem always to confirm the other. The primary pattern is that each has an inside and an outside. Each is porous. Each has a boundary that is always requiring defense. And danger, therefore, lurks in all directions. That it links porosity with danger, which is not, a necessary pattern, of course. The inside-outside ambivalence is dangerous as well because bodies are not transparent. In Europe, for much of the period under examination, most people classed as pestilential people were not visible as such. They had to be discovered and differentiated. Heresy, for example, or witchcraft was forced into visibility through torture and other means. In sum, hatred wants enemies, brings them into visibility, and inscribes its power upon and into their bodies. And as we've seen in the discussion of victimhood, hatred wants to be both violent and innocent. Dominic Listel's work on hatred of animals reverberates in counterpoint to the intrahuman story. His Hatred of Animals essay argues that a deep and abiding Western hatred of animals is actually ontological. That is, it's directed less toward anything the animal does and more toward its very existence. One strand of his argument concerns the curious mindset that wants both to cause suffering and to deny that animals actually do suffer. It's no accident, Listel contends, that the machine image of the animal arose concurrently with the practice of vivisection. And yet the issues go deeper. He proposes that Western societies are constituted against nature in general and against the animal in particular. It follows, he proposes, that in sustaining the position against animals, humans want to make animals suffer. Animal suffering, Listel contends, is a pathological pillar of Western thought. Well, the great replicating and oscillating pattern in this iteration of micro and macrocosms is the animal who is both within and without. And here, too, there's an us versus them boundary, there's porosity, and there's danger. And here, too, with animals as with persecuted humans, hatred wants to inscribe itself into animal bodies, vilifying, tormenting, and killing them with the implicit logic of purification. Animal suffering caused by humans is similar to human torture. It accomplishes on an embodied scale what it asserts on an abstract scale, that is, human sovereignty. Its performative action is to break into the bodies and life worlds of animals. I'm going to take up this point in the context of a dispersal, and after a brief description, I'm going to return to the analysis. The aim of a dispersal is to fracture the site fidelity which holds flying foxes so determinedly to their camp, and to force them to move on. Dispersals thus go to the heart of flying fox life, their mental maps, their reproduction and nurturance of their young, their subsistence, their desire for home places. While there are legal controls on dispersal methods and timing, here too cruelty is being currently reauthorized. The Queensland government is changing rules so that local councils won't have to get permits to disperse colonies. They'll be self-monitoring, basically. What keeps flying foxes in their camp at a given moment is their own deep site fidelity. The torment used in dispersals is designed to break that using standard techniques of torture, sonic torture, physical pain in the form of smoke and chemicals, the use of bright lights, and the removal of trees. Videos taken during a dispersal in the Queensland town of Barcaldine using lights, noise, and chainsaws shows the whole process. It's undertaken at night, and as the flying foxes come home after a night of foraging, tired and ready to sleep, they find their home has become a place of torment. The cries of juveniles who've left behind in the camp are clearly audible, and the panic of adults who don't know what is happening and can't get to their kids is visibly evident. A few of them brave the noise and lights to land in a tree, and slowly, inexorably, the people with chainsaws cut the tree down. By sunrise, all that is left is a desolation of dead trees and disappeared flying foxes. So these people went to considerable effort to get the flying foxes out of their backyard. Janina Bowman, a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, tells us that the cruelest part of cruelty is the dehumanization. Is there an animal counterpart? I'm asking. Are flying foxes also dehumanized, or perhaps more appropriately depersonalized? Not quite sure of the language here. And I think there's a triple answer. I think that the process of depersonalization, if that's what it is, requires that flying foxes be humanized, then dehumanized, and then deanimalized. Or depersonalized in the sense of losing their way of living meaningfully within the world. So first, it's clear that these animals are not being identified in a neutral way. They're humanized as enemies. Their presence in people's backyards is spoken of as akin to warfare. They poison the water and spread lethal diseases. They kill children. They cross boundaries of private property. They attack people's safety, security, and prosperity. The rhetoric of hatred humanizes flying foxes by constructing the identity of the enemy. They become the animal counterpart to the killable person who's made vulnerable to cruelty and torture and death. It is clear that humans use hatred to authorize similar visions of total sovereignty in relation to other animals. The second part of depersonalization of animals is vilification, particularly the language of pests, that is making them pests in order to vilify them, but also having readily available already a language of vilification associated with pests. So a large research and technology industry exists in Australia to kill or otherwise control pests. And my colleague Tom Van Duren has written eloquently about invasive species and the problematic of killing for conservation. When flying foxes are classed as a pest rather than as an endangered species, let's say, they are slipped into an existing category with ready-made justifications for killing. And a third step in depersonalization is the de-animalization. Flying foxes, you will recall, are participants in biosocial loops that are located across generations and geographies that involve trees and shrubs, home sites, long-distance travel, each other, and much else that we humans will never grasp at all. So the category pest discursively eradicates that life and authorizes physical eradication as well. And so de-animalization goes on in cascades of violence, tree by tree, camp by camp, breaking into the meaning of life in relation to place, breaking into the bodies of lost juveniles and desperate mothers, cutting into the future of flying foxes and forests. I want to say a few words about evil, drawing on the work of Emmanuel Levinas, particularly his essay, Useless Suffering. I should have said at the outset that this is a work in progress, and this is one of the less developed areas. I wasn't going to use the word evil at first because I felt that it gave too much credit, I suppose, to people like Bob Catter. But I've changed my view on that as I've worked with the material. Levinas shows that suffering eradicates meaning within the one who suffers. It takes over the whole being, destroying not just the body, but the being. Evil, he goes on to say, is the deliberate infliction of suffering and thus the eradication of meaning in the others. So it's this strong sense of evil in relation to animals that interests me. It depends on the fact that there is a meaning world or a life world to be attacked. And here I pause to thank Brett for ontoethologies and all the others who've done so much work to help us not have to argue all over again and again that animals do inhabit worlds of meaning. In the longer final version of this paper, after I've heard what the rest of you have to say, I'm going to develop this strong analysis of evil to a greater extent than I can do today. I'm particularly interested just now in how evil erases itself. The September 7 decision was authorized by a language of managerial oversight in which questions of cruelty were cunningly deflected. Recall the words of Minister for Environment Andrew Powell spoke of his confidence that all the killing would be as humane as possible. And I want to say we see here the non-performativity of anti-cruelty, paraphrasing Sarah Ahmed's inspired analysis. Non-performative acts offer the impression of accomplishing something, but the discursive act takes the place of real action and may even get in the way of real action. So Minister Powell's assurance, first off, we can say it works with words that deflect the actuality of the matters being addressed. He talks about culling rather than killing. He talks about humane rather than without cruelty or suffering. And his statement of confidence, it will be, as he has said it will be, takes the place of any program to ensure that even the minimal elements of prevention of cruelty would be monitored or enforced. So his bland assurance is almost certain to fulfill the core function of non-performatives, that is, of not bringing about the effects that they name. In this case, the non-performative both denies and authorizes cruelty. Okay, I want to turn now to the other side of this story. Isabel Stinger uses the term spiritual capture to gesture toward the sense of powerlessness that overtakes us all too often as we consider the disasters of the world and realize how they're accelerating and overwhelming us. She talks of sorcery, suggesting that we are under a spell, and she calls, therefore, not for revolution, but for antidotes. One antidote she offers is actually this living world, the world we are rapidly wrecking. And in her beautiful essay on peace, she argues for a cosmopolitics, which defines peace as an ecological production of actual togetherness. Not unity, she says, but connection. Antidotes require slow work, not only in the sense of taking time, slowing down, doing things carefully, but also in the sense of living in the present temporalities, localities, and relationalities of our actual lives. So with thoughts of antidotes, slowness, and attentiveness to the present providing context, I want now to take you to a very different backyard in Queensland. And to the backyard of the extraordinary flying fox carer, Jenny Mclean. This is the Tolga Bat Hospital, located on the outskirts of the town of Atherton in North Queensland, actually in the heart of Bob Catter's electorate. The hospital is in Jenny's backyard. She's the founder and director. She's an outstanding flying fox advocate and carer. The Bat Hospital is both a care facility and an education center. Here is a flying fox that had got tangled up in barbed wire. That's one of the many hazards of life. And they're sort of trying to treat it and hopefully rehabilitate it. Her flying fox closure provides generously for the creature's desire to be high above ground, to have room to fly around and everything. Overall, her work is extremely well organized, and she's just added a new building to the backyard to improve her care facilities and to have a working area where scientific research can be conducted with the flying foxes who are in long-term care. They're not, you couldn't say they were willing participants. None of them have actually put up their hand to volunteer, but they are there, and she has extremely strong oversight of the methods of research. The main species of flying fox in this region are the endangered spectacled flying fox, the speckies. They're the main pollinators and seed dispersers for the wet tropics World Heritage Area there in North Queensland, the Daintree. The crucial period is October, November, and December of each year. That's the time when the babies are totally dependent on their mothers. Female flying foxes do not foster, so if the mother dies, the dependent baby is orphaned. In this part of the Atherton tablelands, flying foxes at this crucial period are actually foraging on the berries of an invasive weed from South America. And their foraging brings them close to the ground, and when they're close to the ground, they become prey to paralysis ticks. They have not developed resistance to the toxin. They never used to forage close to the ground, and so they actually succumb to the paralysis. Mothers fall out of trees with the babies still clinging to the nipple. Unable to move, they call out in distress. Or babies are left in the trees waiting for mothers who never return. Jenny and her dedicated team of volunteers walk the forest, and volunteers come from all over the world to participate in this work during this time of year. They walk the forest looking and listening for flying foxes and rescuing them. Some can be saved, many cannot, and many babies are orphaned, either because the mother's already dead or is too far gone to be saved. So at times up to 200 orphan babies are being fed every 4 hours by a team of volunteers. Well, Jenny is a fifth-generation Queenslander. Her ancestors settled this area, chopping down forests, displacing and killing native animals, and dispossessing, perhaps killing, indigenous people. In short, they were active participants in the war against natives and nature that characterizes so much of the formation of settler societies. Hesitantly and with deep humility, she spoke of how her efforts may work against that history. In the sense she's engaged in a very strong act of decolonization. But it's not only reparative work in dialogue with the past, important as this is. The purpose of care is to sustain all those who have a chance of survival and return them to their forest homes as soon as they are ready for release. Back in the bush, of course, they're subject to all the hatred and vilification and killing that I have just been discussing. As new legislation enables greater numbers of direct and indirect deaths of flying foxes, Jenny's work slides into a grim and horrifying dynamic of love versus hatred played out in the lives and deaths and futures of flying foxes. Each individual life and death matters, and the fact that the main species in this area is endangered adds greatly to the precarity of the whole situation. When I asked Jenny quite directly why she does this work, she spoke of simply being there. The suffering was going on around her. She was there, and so she responded. Being an extraordinarily practical person, she responded by building the best hospital facility in Australia, setting up a non-profit organization, organizing volunteers, offering education programs, hosting scientific research, and finding ways to ensure that it will all continue after she's gone. All this inspiring practicality may have the effect, as Nigel Clarke has suggested in his recent book, In Human Nature, have the effect of carrying us a bit too quickly across the more mysterious questions of community, ethics, and responsibility in this time of extinction. Clarke has articulated a question of slow ethical recognition extremely effectively in this book. The chapters on the Indian Ocean tsunami and Hurricane Katrina Stay with an ethical response that arises in the face of the direct distress of others. He is critical of a rush to settle disaster within familiar discourses of justice and globalization, even though it belongs there, of course. But he says not to rush too fast, because rushing too fast may move too quickly across the truly miraculous moment, which is the response of suffering as it arises without or before frames of analysis. It arises simply because something is happening and people respond. In his words, his focus remains with a sensuous receptivity to the plight of others that does not oppose reasoned or deliberated action, but actually is the very condition of a just and effective engagement with an inherently immoderate situation. And he's drawing on Derrida, Levinas, Nancy, of whom we're going to be hearing more in a moment. Okay, in my research in Australia and in the United States, I've got case studies in Hawaii as well. One of the most frequent responses to my question about why people do the work they do, offering their life's energy and time to defending and protecting animals, many people have responded defensively, asking why they should have to justify what they do. I actually have not been seeking justification, but clearly my questions hit a nerve, and that nerve announces itself with refusal. People refuse to justify why they're doing what they're doing, saying at most because they can. And they refuse to justify their refusal to justify their actions. In short, they refused all justification. So as a research scholar, I have the honor of taking this refusal totally seriously, of trying to meet it on its own terms. Since I do not want to justify the refusal to justify, I'm seeking rather to provide or start to begin a poetics of refusal and to uncover an enhanced vocabulary surrounding refusal. So I'm going to, in the longer version, I'm going to work my way towards such a poetics through three philosophers whose work I think is uniquely relevant here. I think I'm probably wrong to say uniquely, though, because I think Mick's work with Nancy would be equally relevant. I've been thinking of working with Alfonso Lingus in the community of those who have nothing in common, and with Emmanuel Levinas and his useless suffering. And most especially in the interest of time for today, I'm just going to speak a little bit about Edith Vichogrod. I'm drawing primarily on her excellent essay, Man-Made Mass Death, Shifting Concepts of Community. She addresses the question of how Levinas's philosophy relates to community and argues that man-made mass death must inevitably affect our understandings of community. A belief that the anthropogenic mass extinction event now in process is to be understood as another man-made mass death event. Vichogrod uses the term death event to identify the nexus, this particular nexus that concerns us here, this nexus in which the large-scale numbers of what's happening are taking place in a compressed period of time. So the scale of numbers and the compression of time are what constitute a death event in her vocabulary. And it seems to be equally true to both genocide and mass extinction. She discusses communities in light of the fact that we live in the shadow of and amongst death events, and is within this world of death events that she analyzes the possibilities for community. She comes to the term unavowable community by drawing on Blanchot with the aim of reworking his usage to specifically identify the particular community that forms under the shadow of what she does not fear to call apocalypse. I think we've all experienced criticism for using the word apocalypse, and I suppose I have some hesitations about it myself, but it's very nice to see somebody actually using that term because of the seriousness with which it accords this event. The unavowable community has these specific characteristics. First, that it does not lead to communion or fusion of singular identities, but at the same time affirms both difference and being together of singularities. And second, that it is involved with death and with the desire to prevent extinction or extermination. And third, that it works with unwork, the désœuvrement, the unworking of Nancy, the placing of myself at the disposal of another, and which may be thought, as with Levinas, as a doubled refusal, that is, the refusal to justify either their suffering or our care. The key feature is people's responsiveness to the life-death needs of others. So the unavowable community, or what I think I would prefer to call the death age community, forms in spaces in the social web where in the death age the desire for the other's continued existence can be expressed in discourse and action. That's a quote from Visegrad. It involves making a way for the other without demanding reciprocity, and therefore it offers primacy to the other and accepts that there may be no future for those who are being exterminated. The response is not calculated on the probabilities of an outcome. These ethical subjects belong to, and I quote, an unavowable community, a broken architecture, one without blueprint, of a building without foundation, in this era of mass death. How much time do I have left, Brett? 5? Perfect. Okay. I have a very, very brief conclusion, and then I would like to show you a little bit of video. So the conclusion is really just a summing up, that the death age communities involve people at the front line in what Stenner calls peace in the mode of ecological production of actual togetherness in this era of extinctions. Both individuals and communities are antidotes to the venom of hatred. We learn from Jenny's backyard that her multi-species community involves a practice of dedication and love and hard work and profound commitment. For Jenny, as for other people I've interviewed, that community will not justify itself by appealing to the rational community or to forms of rational calculus geared toward a final outcome or towards some perceived reciprocity, but rather will defend itself as itself without fully articulating itself. And I think that its refusals are one of the greatest gifts in this troubled time. Now, another antidote is the actual exuberance of animals themselves as they go about their lives, because they're full of what we're finding so troubling. That is, they are full of the desire to live, the desire to inhabit their life worlds, to be themselves in the world as they live. And it's always important to remember this, that we're not alone in our desire for life. And I want to take you just briefly now to Aboriginal community called Port Keats in the Northern Territory, where I had heard that there was a massive, hundreds of thousands of flying foxes camping in the mangroves. So I went out there with my little handheld shaky camera to film them. And I want to show you a little bit of the creatures themselves in their most awesome beauty.
Okay, so while we get the video, find the video, that video was going to be the conclusion, so let's thank Debbie for her talk. So I think what we'll do is have questions, comments, discussion, and while this has started, if the video's found, we can play the video, okay? So questions, comments, discussion for Debbie? Yeah, Ursula?
I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more something that you mentioned at the beginning. So you said there were 4 species of flying foxes, and at least 2 of them, or perhaps all 4, are covered by some kind of endangered species legislation. So at least the 2 species should be protected against the sort of persecution that you described, right? So are people who kill those ever fined, or I mean, what is the problem with the law, or is it with the implementation of the law? In the case of those 2 species, and then what about the other 2 that are not technically protected? Are those just is there no law covering them? So I'm kind of obsessed with endangered species laws right now.
Yeah, great.
Figuring out how they work.
And how they don't work, which is in some ways, yeah. So every native species in Australia is covered by the Native Species Act, and can't be killed without a permit unless you're Aboriginal. If you're an Aboriginal person, you can kill native species, but Aborigines aren't the problem here. And then the 2 that are known to be endangered are protected under the Endangered Species Act or Threatened Species Act. So if you're going to kill any flying foxes at all, you have to apply for a permit. And how that permit is handled would have a bearing on whether the species was endangered or not. But given that species often camp together, it wouldn't be feasible to say, okay, you could kill the blacks but not the grays, because it just wouldn't be a viable, it wouldn't be possible to make that choice if they're mixed in together. So the National Parks and Wildlife Service is the organizing body that has the statutory duty, first to protect these animals, and second to issue licenses to kill them. And it's all meant to be monitored. Nobody has ever really been prosecuted for killing flying foxes. The only things people have really been in trouble for is, in a sense, refusing the law. So there was quite a confrontation in Queensland a few years ago over the use of electric grids to keep flying foxes out of orchards, and this was so violently and hideously caused so much hideous suffering that it was finally outlawed, and then certain orchardists just refused to take down their grids and kept using them. So they went to court, not for what they did to flying foxes, but for just defying the court order to dismantle the grid.
I'm not getting this then.
No.
So if the Native Species Act says you can't kill any of the flying foxes without a permit,
Yeah.
why can't somebody who puts up an ad like bomb the bats, why could they not be sued? It's right there. And that should be, just legally, that should be sued.
Yeah, well,
It's not illegal under law. I mean, it's inciting somebody
to break the law, yeah. Well, that is one of the very curious things about it. That's how that kind of hatred normalizes itself, is it just becomes a little bit funny, a little bit of a joke, but under that little bit funny, little bit joke is all this violence.
But that would be one way for anti-killing activists.
Well, actually, they are now.
That this is actually not normalized by the law.
Yeah, they are now, or have already met, I'm not sure, dismantled the legislation against incitement to violence.
So can you tell us a little bit about the biology of the particular species? So you didn't tell us how big these camps are. How are they permanent, intergenerational?
Yeah.
So if you live on the land, because you said farmers have a problem ostensibly,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why it changed. But what you showed us was disbursement in a kind of suburban area.
Mm-hmm.
So when you buy a piece of land that's already there, and you move in, or how long do they stay?
A lot of their patterns appear to be changing. They are becoming more urban and more sedentary, like lots of people, and that's to do with the loss of native. Something like 97% of native forests have already been cut down in New South Wales, say. So huge amounts of their capacity to continue their nomadic existence is gone. Formerly, the camps were really huge. Like a camp might have 100,000. Even in the 1980s in New South Wales, they were documenting camps of 80 to 100,000 flying foxes. They're quite difficult to count, but people are getting better at it. And when they leave, they tend, and they're really great creatures for doing things together. They camp together, they socialize together, they sometimes engage in bouts of mass mating, as it seems to be called in the literature. And often when they leave together. So in the course of maybe over 2 or 3 nights, 80 or 100,000 flying foxes will leave and not come back. But they don't all go to the same place. So it becomes very difficult. It's also another factor in trying to count the populations, because they're dispersing to different places, dispersing themselves to different places, unless you've got radio collars or satellite monitoring, you really don't know where they are, which ones have gone where.
Maybe on that, because we have the video up, if we can just show the video, and then I see Tom with the question, so we can come back to questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, we can leave it running. There's really just one thing I wanted to say to you, so this is this flyout that I went out to film, and it's they're flying up off the mangroves. They're sort of flying across the mangroves, so following the Gulf south. They're going south out into the savanna woodlands to the south of here, and this I didn't film the whole thing. I couldn't film what was above me, and I didn't keep filming until the last one had gone. But this is just really gives you a sense of the numbers and the kind of fabulous glory of these things as they lead these lives of camping together and flying out together. And the particular point I wanted to make just while this thing is running was this, that I said earlier that that the fact that humans are porous beings doesn't have to be construed as a danger to be overcome. It can actually be construed as a kind of, how we interact with the world, and take it as a relational, interactive blessing rather than a danger. And that's much more of an Aboriginal way of doing things. So anyhow, a couple of nights before I got there, they had changed their pattern a little bit, and instead of flying along over the mangroves and out that way, they'd actually turned slightly to the east and flew directly over the community. And the kids were all out playing as of the last light of day, last chance to play before they have to go in and eat. And when the flying foxes came over, they started looking, and they all stopped, and then they started cheering. And they just stood there and cheered. They cheered the bats going overhead. So I think, that's another kind of response is, my gosh, what an amazing thing. What an amazing world. What amazing life there is.
Tom, you had a question?
I was sort of hoping in the video that give you pause on the brain that talk my mouth, but we're actually not trying this. If it did work, I'll try it anyway. That was a very interesting talk. Thank you very much. I guess, when you get these interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary sorts of venues, you start to appreciate how other people sort of see information and knowledge that comes from other fields, and they work it in their talks and so on. So I'm sitting here as a natural scientist, and I hear a number of claims at the front of your talk that are, that could be falsified claims about a functional role of the keystone species or a negative impact of the species on humans or something. And I guess I'm just wondering, in the context of your other thesis, does it matter whether those claims have validity or the reliability, the probability that we can associate with those claims and their degree of truthiness? Does it matter to your thesis in the end about sort of the origins of animal hatred and so forth, and the deeper respects? And the reason I ask this is because it seems to me that in a lot of these debates about species conservation, we get hung up a lot, and we can debate a lot the merits of a particular scientific fact that someone's using as leverage. And you made some claims that you took from that natural science literature that you could sort of take away and start your argument. And I'm sitting here going, I wonder how they know if that's a keystone species, because in my field, those are testable hypotheses, right? So, how do you see the relationship between the reliability of that natural history evidence in the first place, and whether it matters that you take care of these facts or not make this decision?
Gosh, that's a very interesting question. I talk with a lot of scientists in the course of this research, and I read a lot of their work, and I feel that I have a pretty good sense of where the disagreements are and where the reliabilities are. So I don't think there's any doubt about there being a keystone species. There may be some doubt as to what functional extinction of flying foxes is going to mean for forests. Will birds and bees fill in? It matters to me that it be as correct as possible, because I want to understand these animals as best I can, and I don't have the skills to go out and do the kind of research that you guys do. So yeah, it matters to me, but I've been very, very concerned. I don't want the argument against hatred to rest on the fact that they're keystone species. It's important to understanding who they are. It's important to, this paper is going to contribute to a book I'm working on called The Kiss of Life, which is my humanities gloss on symbiotic mutualism. And so it matters that the information be correct, and it matters that we understand that those interactions, because that's the basis from which we might also understand ourselves as parts of ecosystems.
Thanks, I'm glad I tried.
think we've got time for maybe one more question, or maybe possibly two.
Yes, and I'm going to try too, because I'm also a biologist, but I'm a biologist that studied bats. And I think that would be maybe unusual, or at least stand out in the issue of being persecuted. So it's the flying foxes of Australia, of course, but the same thing happens in North America with our little insectivorous temperate bats. And so, and there seems to be, and I don't understand it, but it's some sort of paranoia or something built in that seems to have people react very oddly, I think, to these animals. And I'm wondering, would your arguments be different if this was a different species, or bats somehow in a different category yet again from other animals you might talk about?
Well, there are quite a few animals that do have a sort of hate language that goes with them. Like wolves would be one, or dingoes. You know, those kind of top order predators have another whole sort of dimension of hate that goes with them. But yeah, I think you're right. It isn't something I've looked at close enough yet. I wasn't raised to fear bats or any of that stuff, and I don't really get it myself. But I was really struck. I was in North America over Halloween, and I was reminded of how intense the bat image is as this kind of horror, fear, scare stuff. And clearly they're tapping into that kind of stuff. In fact, somebody told me a while back that there's even a word, I forget what it is, some big Latin-derived word that means the fear of having a bat get tangled up in your hair. So there's certain kinds of fears here that are part of it, and people do tap into. Yeah. Bat out of hell is also a very common theme in headlines. They have 2 or 3, bomb the bats, bat out of hell, 2 or 3 that they use a lot.
I think we have time for one more question.
I wanted to bring up the topic of evil, and I know that you're just beginning to look into that. Evil is, of course, a very Judeo-Christian concept. So, for example, in other cosmologies, like the Buddhist cosmology, there is no evil. There is ignorance, and destruction comes from ignorance. So, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question to ask about this topic of the deliberate infliction of suffering, and whether it is in the human or deeply wedged in the human. And if you think about vivisection, for example, vivisection takes off exactly when Descartes gives a rationale. Descartes comes around and he says, they're automata, they're machines, they don't feel pain, they don't suffer. And then this allows people to perform vivisection. And in a way, that's absolutely horrific, and we can ask whether people who are actually doing vivisection couldn't witness the suffering they were inflicted. But on the other side of it, it offers some kind of, it offers a prism on that maybe people cannot bear suffering when they see it. And so they have to build theories, and they have to sort of put down animals by taking away their minds, by taking, all these theories to say that the suffering isn't there. And at the moment that you can bring that suffering, or you can bring the exuberance forth, then people cannot inflict that suffering. So I don't know if there's a question in there, but this notion of evil, and that perhaps that doesn't actually really exist.
I wonder if the question in there is whether it's strictly dependent on the perception of the person who causes the suffering, or whether it can be disentangled from. Because if you're causing something to suffer, but you don't believe that that's suffering, you think that animal is a machine, what is your role in that suffering then, I guess would be the question. And I mean, whether we use the word evil or not, it still seems to be one of those big questions. It's like, I didn't know the gun was loaded. Well, are you therefore not culpable? It's a tough one. It's one of those fault lines, I think, maybe in Western thought about some of these things, whether it's individual intention or effect, I guess.
Okay. So, thank you so much, Debbie.
Thank you.